Chapter 3. There was great concern at Hanover Place for my welfare, as I had thus far spent my separation period in a state of deterioration. Nothing corporeal mattered to me any more. My thoughts had become so consumed with visions of my sweet Annie, I was completely unaware of everything around me, including the growing number of animal bite cases that were being brought to Dr. Hanover's office for evaluation. It was as though I was walking through each day blind to everything around me. It was not merely my inattentiveness which had so concerned my friends. It was my complete inability to thrive. I could neither eat nor sleep. I had become like a tortured shadow of my former self. When I was not pacing the floor, I was curled up on the sofa near the front parlor window, lost in the void which had become my heart. 7 different people, on 7 different occasions, had joined me in the parlor over the first few weeks, waiting to have their bite marks evaluated by the good doctor, and I never took notice. Thankfully, Sir Happy wasted little time in enacting his plan to deliver me from my gloom. It was mid-morning, and I had once again assumed my favorite sulking perch by the front parlor window. I do not remember much of what happened leading up to the moment of my friend's intervention. I only remember the sharp jab in the side, which was its beginning. "What in the world?" I exclaimed, being in no mood to be trifled with. I swung around, fully prepared to unleash the full measure of my displeasure on my aggressor. I was not surprised to find Sir Happy's black eyes staring back at me. "I am in no mood," I began, irritation dripping from my every word. Before I could get another word out, Sir Happy poked me again. My annoyance boiled over, and before I knew what I was doing, I rapped him soundly on the head, not once, but 3 times. Every ounce of frustration and anguish poured out in those 3 blows in a mighty torrent. As soon as I was done, a mixture of shame and satisfaction washed over me. Shame at having struck the very person who had offered me shelter in his home, and satisfaction at having so boldly defended myself. I was prepared for whatever retaliation might be brought to bear. The response I received was a complete surprise. Sir Happy's face broke out into the most wonderful smile, and he asked, "Do you feel better now?" I had no idea what to say. The truth was I did feel better. A bit drained, but better. Almost against my will, I broke out into a hearty chuckle. I was greatly relieved when Sir Happy chimed in with his own round of warm laughter. I tried to apologize for my ungentlemanly conduct. Sir Happy shook his head and said with a grin, "Nothing to it, old chap. Sometimes, when our feelings get bottled up inside us, we just need an outlet to help let them vent. I knew if I poked you enough times, you would let some of your internal pressure out." His face sobered a bit as he continued, "Besides, we were getting worried about you. You were beginning to look a little rough around the edges." He pointed at the wall mirror next to me. "Take a look if you don't believe me." It was true. I had not examined my appearance in the looking-glass for some time. I had expected to be a bit disheveled, as I had been rather neglectful of my grooming, but I was shocked by what I saw reflected back at me. The weeks of not eating had taken their toll. My cheeks were hollow from all the weight I had lost, and my eyes were overshadowed by dark circles. Even my hair seemed dull and severely unkempt. I looked positively terrible. For the first time, I realized what a danger my sorrow had become. When supper was called, I made a point to eat everything served to me. As I sat there devouring my meal, I looked upon my friend with new eyes, grateful for the risk he had taken to help save my life. Anything could have happened at the moment Sir Happy stepped in to intercede. I knew now he had prepared himself for the worst. He has saved me from danger many times since that day, but I will always remember Sir Happy's intervention as the moment when we passed the threshold from acquaintances to lifelong friends. As I recollect my first few weeks at Hanover Place, it seems quite fitting I should endeavor to provide a more complete description of the rather quirky and complex individual who would play such a central role in my future narratives. Although it is possible to deduce much about the character of Sir Happy Heart from the little I have written thus far, I feel it necessary to expand on this venue so future narratives of my dear friend might be completely understood. Were one to undertake a study of behavioral contrasts, there could be no better subject than the inimitable person of my dear friend Sir Happy. Not in the entire world could there be another whose ever-changing activity and disposition remain at such odds with each other. I find even now, after so many years of friendship, a difficulty in putting into words the many facets of his temperament and spirit which combine together to complete his nature. Having offered a confession of my own inadequacies, I shall now plunge into the valuations of his character. Sir Happy is focused in his pursuits, yet at times exhibits extreme absent-mindedness. He can be patient and impulsive, stubborn and yielding, stern and soft-hearted. There is no limit to his generosity towards others. He is loyal to his friends and fiercely protective of innocence. He has a ready smile, but at times suffers from intense depression, most especially when he is idle. His nature requires he be doing something, anything, so long as it is a constructive activity that takes full advantage of his talents and interests. You see, my dear friend was born very gifted. From what I have discovered of his past, he has always had the uncanny ability to observe the world with all its subtleties and nuances and discern the minutest details. Details which are often overlooked by individuals who are highly trained in the art of investigation. My initial introduction to him was only a small glimpse into the observant and curious mind of Sir Happy Heart. His focused and at times single-minded approach has enabled him to discover revealing clues from the mundane environment in which various crimes have been committed. In other words, he is a natural-born detective, and he has spent many years perfecting his craft, offering his assistance in solving crimes and uncovering the truth behind whatever mysteries come across his path. For other, less noble creatures, such a gift might give rise to less attractive characteristics like vanity and self-aggrandizement. This is not the case with Sir Happy. Although he is unquestionably aware of his rare gifts, his purpose in offering his assistance in deciphering clues and unraveling mysteries is quite simply to help his fellow creature. Sir Happy believes with all his heart his gifts were meant to be shared, without ceremony and completely without self-praise. He has often said, "What would it profit me to glorify myself for what Providence has seen fit to bestow upon me? It would be sheer folly for all involved and would be a complete waste of my energies." I have never known Sir Happy to be unwilling to share credit for any case or mystery he has solved. On the contrary, he is most willing to allow others to receive the commendation and praise for his work, while he takes comfort in knowing he did his part to protect the innocent from further harm. His humility is definitive and yet understated, causing even the most casual observer to experience a level of awe at so magnificent and yet so modest a creature. Were his gifts the sum of his character, some might think him merely special and be done with the revaluation. Thankfully for Sir Happy, his talents are but the beginning of his intricate character. Having a heart for the less fortunate, a point which I myself find favorable in a gentleman, my dear friend has made it his aim to reach out to the impoverished of London and offer his services to them regardless of their circumstances. It is an unfortunate truth that the destitute, being reduced to such meager and pitiable conditions as London's slums can provide, are often inundated with the most heinous evils humanity's heart can invent. It is for this reason such an ingenious mind would be made available to every beggar, costermonger, flower girl, dock worker, and rat catcher throughout the length and breadth of London. Sir Happy's tenacity is legendary, and so is his love of the chase. There is little which gives him more pleasure than tracking down the miscreants, scoundrels, misfits, and over all evil doers of the world, except perhaps receiving a good scratch behind the ears and taking a long nap in his cozy bed by the fire. He is, after all, a consummate keep-seeker, but such is always the case with short-haired black and tan dachshunds, which is exactly what Sir Happy Heart is. He is the best of his breed in all things which matter in life, and it is my distinct honor to call him my friend. Having done my best to paint as honest and as trustworthy a picture of the complex nature of my dear friend, I shall once again return to my narrative. Chapter 4. My journey back to health was a long and tenuous one. My manic sorrow had initially provided me with a self-consuming energy which had carried me through weeks of heartache and meaningless activity. The moment I surrendered my heart and my person to the care of my friends, however, all semblance of strength evaporated, and I found myself completely incapacitated. I had grown so weak, in fact, I could no longer care for myself as I always had before, which leads me to the introduction of two additional members of the Hanover home. I shall begin their introduction by recounting the circumstances which led to their inclusion in the household. Having no interest in law or parliament, Stephen Hanover had elected to attend one of the leading medical schools in all of Europe to pursue a path of service to his fellow man, a career path which was neither lucrative when compared with his family's considerable fortune, nor prestigious in the eyes of many of his acquaintances, but would prove to be rather meaningful nonetheless. While in the midst of his rigorous education, Stephen took an interest in the burgeoning field of animal medicine and discovered it to be his greatest love. With the blessings of his father to back him, Stephen took to his new science with a passion. He graduated with highest honors and was awarded the Queen's Medal of Academic Excellence, an honor which made his father very proud. Stephen then went on to publish his doctoral thesis on the inherent immunity passed from mother to baby in the Ecuadorian painted fruit bat, or some such animal, which had been observed for an extended period of time by my dear friend, a work that afforded him positive recognition from a number of well-respected naturalists within the scientific community. It was a bittersweet victory for Stephen, however, because his father passed away within a few days of its publication. Within a few short months, Dr. Hanover, as he was now called, became a man of considerable means, having been left upon his father's death a yearly living of some £10,000, a sizable estate in the country, and a large home in the heart of one of London's most respected neighborhoods were also included as part of his inheritance. The London home was perfect for establishing a medical practice, and it was within very short order that Dr. Stephen Hanover opened one of the city's first veterinary clinics, dedicated to the care of animals both large and small. It was an instant success, but as with all worthwhile endeavors, his success came at a price. With more than 15 rooms and 2 large parlors, the home itself was far too large for this confirmed bachelor to care for on his own, especially with the unprecedented growth of his clinic. The Hanover practice quickly spiraled into a highly demanding burden which became more than one man could carry. The short of it was, Stephen needed help, beyond the few faithful servants who remained on after his father's death. At the very moment when things began to accelerate out of control, in stepped Charles and Amelia Hurst. There is a kind of sweetness in the hearts of some individuals with which flows in such abundance. Casual observers cannot help but be affected by it. Such is the case with Charles and Amelia. When I say sweetness, I do not refer to the prosaic, well-worn cliché so often overused to describe the tritest expressions. The sweetness I speak of in the Hearsts reflects a more genuine goodness and kindness rarely seen in an individual, much less in a devoted couple. No two people could be more perfectly matched in heart and sensibility than these two souls. Their agreeable natures and their generous hearts combine together to create an overall lovability which is immediately irresistible. It was this lovability that first attracted Stephen to the Hearsts. Charles and Amelia were newlyweds, having not quite reached their first year of matrimonial bliss when misfortune struck them. Charles lost his factory job due to labor cuts, and Amelia was released from her job at the textile mill after missing 2 days due to a serious lung infection. Money had always been tight for them, but now the couple found themselves without any income at all. It was in the midst of these circumstances that they met Dr. Hanover. It began one day when Amelia was walking from the corner butcher shop back to her flat, having picked up a bit of meat for hers and Charles' supper. She was taking a shortcut by way of a side alley when she was stopped by the sound of a faint mewing coming from a nearby rubbish heap. Upon closer inspection, she found a small, starving kitten literally at death's door. Without hesitation, she scooped him up and carried him home, wrapping him safely in the warm folds of her outer coat. Upon arriving at the flat, Amelia flew into the arms of her husband to show him what she had found. There was little question in either of their minds. Something had to be done for this small soul, but neither one was certain what that something was. Charles then remembered hearing about a doctor in Wiltshire who cared for small animals. They took immediate action to save the kitten, leaving the package of cold meat Amelia had purchased for their supper forgotten on the kitchen table. Charles used their last shilling to hire a cab to take them to Wiltshire in search of this now legendary doctor. After a few well-placed inquiries, the couple located the good doctor's home. Thankfully for the Hearsts, Dr. Hanover was in, and although the day had been a harrowing one for him, he knew immediately upon their arrival the situation was a grave one. After ushering them past the front parlor and into an examination room, Dr. Hanover said, "Please waste no time in sharing all the particulars of your case. I could tell from the somberness of your expressions and the worry lines on your brows a precious life was at stake." With great care, Amelia removed the furry bundle from the inside of her coat. The kitten was so small one would barely notice the lump his little form had made beneath the layers of coarse wool. "Please, sir," Amelia hesitated. Her cheeks flushed with color as she sought the words to explain their case. She found it impossible to ask this man to save the life of a kitten they had just found when they had no money with which to pay him. As Amelia's mind whirled with various explanations, warm tears of frustration coursed down her cheeks. The moments ticked by in agonizing slowness as she found the words to beg for medical mercy. "Please, sir, we found this dying kitten in an alleyway near our home. We didn't know where else to bring him. Please, you must save him, you must." With those last words, she lost all semblance of control over her tears and her helplessness and was quickly on her way to a hearty round of sobs. There, madam," Dr. Hanover began. "There's no need to upset yourself in this way. Let's have a look at this little fellow and see if there isn't something we can do for him." His smile was comforting, and Mrs. Hearst was able to quiet her fears and her tears in the face of his kindness. Charles, on the other hand, was not at ease and very quickly announced, "We have no money with which to pay you. We spent our last coin getting here. We haven't enough money to get ourselves home again, much less pay you for your services." Stephen smiled at the young man and said, I admire your candor, sir, but never mind about my fee. My clinic also hopes to rescue stray animals, and there's no fee for that. I am grateful you brought this kitten to me. Most people would have left him for dead and been done with the matter. I think it took courage and a tremendous amount of character for you to bring him so far. Now, let's have a look at the little one. The good doctor lifted the small creature from under Amelia's grasp and began his examination. Underneath all of this dirt, I see a hint of marmalade-colored fur, he said with a smile. He's excessively weak and undernourished, but I think we can save him if you would be willing to assist me. I am sorry, I did not get your names. Charles cleared his throat, a little embarrassed by his lack of proper etiquette, and said, Charles and Amelia Hurst, at your service, sir. I am Stephen Hanover, and I am thoroughly glad to meet you both. He held out his hand in welcome to each in turn and continued where he had left off. As I was saying, if you would be willing to help me, Charles, with a few of my patients, including our little marmalade kitten here, I would be incredibly grateful and most willing to compensate you for your time and efforts. I have been exceedingly overburdened and could use an extra pair of hands. Oh, thank you, Dr. Hanover, Charles began. Please, call me Stephen. Thank you, Stephen. I would be honored to lend a hand wherever I can. Just point me in the direction you need me to go. Stephen positively beamed with delight. I cannot thank you enough, Charles, he exclaimed. Now, Mrs. Hurst, do not think I have forgotten you. Please make yourself at home. I find myself embarrassed by my mess. I fear I am not much of a housekeeper. What I have, however, is at your disposal. Amelia thanked him for making them feel so welcome. Please do not stand on formalities for my sake. I would be pleased to have you call me Amelia, she said. Within short order, Stephen and Charles were taking care of various furry patients, while Amelia began the rather daunting task of reclaiming the clinic portion of the Hanover residence from its extensive neglect. By late evening, much had been accomplished from all of their efforts. Not only did Stephen pay them handsomely for their hard work, he asked them to come back the next day and do much the same thing. In less than a week's time, Stephen had asked them to join him on a full-time basis, offering them a section of Hanover Place to be used as their private quarters. The Hursts were overwhelmed and overjoyed by the offer, and with much shaking of hands and copious tears from Amelia, they accepted their positions as medical assistant and housekeeper, respectively speaking. Incidentally, the little marmalade-colored kitten survived and was shortly given to a certain tender-hearted child named Annie, whom the doctor was well acquainted with, being a particular friend of her parents. There can now be no question in my listeners' minds. I was indeed the little marmalade-colored kitten. My angels of mercy, the dear souls who saved my life when I was a babe, were none other than Charles and Amelia Hurst. Through my separation from my sweet Annie and my subsequent illness, I found my history coming full circle. To my great joy, I was finally able to thank those dear angels of mercy who had originally saved me from certain death. Having introduced the last and for now final members of the Hanover household, I will continue the story where I left off. Chapter 5. As I mentioned previously, Dr. Hanover was examining a large number of bite cases, each one having been brought to his attention by a representative of Scotland Yard, the same striking Inspector Hiram Farley I saw upon my first arrival at Hanover Place. As my body endeavored to heal itself from my neglect, my mind sought the kind of stimulation which can only come from the clinical application of intellectual exertion. And so it was, I began to wonder why a medical professional with a specialty in animal care would be called upon to examine bites on human victims. I can only offer my listeners the same answer I received from Sir Happy when I posed the question to him. It is really quite simple, Mr. Marmee. My Stephen is a specialist not only in animal psychology, which is beneficial in its own right, but he is also a premier authority on animal behavior and animal forensic dentistry, making him the perfect candidate to consult with when it comes to identifying and cataloging animal bites. He has seen more than his share throughout his years of practice, which makes him invaluable to the authorities investigating these attacks. Do you understand now? With such an explanation, it made perfect sense to me. Based on the bite size and pattern, Dr. Hanover could tell Inspector Farley the type of animal that would have produced the bite, along with its relative size, weight, and general health. By making molds of the bites, he could also catalog distinctive identifiers like missing or broken teeth. The most important piece of the puzzle was whether all of these attacks were perpetrated by the same creature or were instigated by a number of different assailants, hence the importance of consulting with a forensic dental expert. I understand precisely now, I said. Nothing to it, old chap. Now, what do you make of these? Sir Happy slid over a stack of grainy, monochromatic photos taken by investigators at the yard. Each one was marked as to the date, time, and location of the attack. These photos date back more than a year, I exclaimed, unable to mask my dismay. Do they believe them all to be connected somehow? And if so, how is it we are only hearing about them now, what with so many of them? My friend shook his head and gave me a somber smile. Unfortunately, the first victims were the poorest of London's poor, meaning their cases were either overlooked or set aside as being a circumstance associated with the conditions of the living environment. Although statements and photos were taken as a matter of reckon for most of them, little was done to find the culprit until now. I was horrified by what he said. If that is the case, what has changed to make the authorities take more notice? Why care now? My sarcasm was unmistakable. The perpetrator has taken a taste for fancier flesh, Sir Happy said with gravity in his voice. Whatever do you mean? I asked. When these attacks first began, Sir Happy replied, they were perpetrated primarily on homeless men between the ages of 25 and 40. They were living on the streets and in the back alleys of London, which made them easier targets, what we might call crimes of opportunity. With these earlier cases, the authorities would have been less likely to become involved in investigating them because they would have assumed the bites were inflicted by street rats, a natural consequence of living on the streets. Admittedly, they do tend to grow large to an alarming degree in the worst sections of town. It was an unfortunate move on the part of the Metropolitan Police Force because the lack of action only served to embolden our wrongdoer. Ow! To a point where attacking the homeless was not enough of a challenge. Our offender moved on to attacking pedestrians and people located in more public venues like flower girls, street merchants, and theater patrons. Now he has set his sights on wealthier neighborhoods and people of means. This creature, whatever he is, has no compunction about attacking young or old, male or female. As his taste in victims has changed, so has his level of brutality. His attacks have become more vicious in nature. What began as superficial fights has escalated into assaults better characterized as maulings. One poor girl nearly lost a leg because of the extent of her injuries. He paused, lost evidently in some thought. I nonchalantly cleared my throat to bring him back to the conversation at hand. Sorry, where was I? Oh, yes. Take a look at the photos again. And beyond the obvious information of date, time, and location, what do you see? I knew my friend was testing my skills of observation to see if I could detect whatever clues he himself had already found. Feeling little up to the challenge, but desiring to give it my best effort, I carefully scrutinized each image. I took my time to prevent overlooking some important detail. I will admit with complete candor, I hoped to impress my observant friend with what has always come naturally to him: perfect clarity in examination. After a significant period of time, I was ready to present my findings. Although I was anxious to display some level of competency, I did not wish to appear overly anxious to my friend. Instead of jumping immediately into a narrative of the clues I believed I had found, I sat back and took a long drink from my afternoon saucer of tea and milk. I attempted to look appropriately thoughtful, mimicking to the best of my ability the majestic profile Sir Happy creates when he is deep in thought. Apparently, patience was not a virtue held by my friend that day, because within only a moment or two he burst forth with, "Out with it, man! You are killing me with anticipation!" Feeling rather the master of the moment, I took a deep breath and began. The photographs, having been arranged in chronological order, has made it relatively easy to see the progression of severity in the bites themselves. The first few cases were indeed so shallow, it is no surprise to me the authorities mistook them for rat bites. I paused in my narrative to see if my friend agreed with me. His only response was a quick nod of the head, which was enough of an encouragement for me to continue. With each successive case, the wounds become more pronounced, clearly indicating an escalation of aggression. I pulled over one of the more recent photos and took a good, hard look. I would say, and this, of course, is my very humble and untrained opinion, the bite marks belong to a relatively large dog, at least one with a powerful head and jaw. "Excellent!" exclaimed Sir Happy. "I have yet to identify the exact breed, but I concluded myself it was definitely canine, with a broad head and powerful jaws. What else?" I swallowed hard, knowing I was now stepping into the more subtle realm of observation, looking for those clues which are often overlooked or missed altogether. I glanced through the photos again. My head began to ache with the mental exercise. It felt for a moment it would be easier to pull a camel through the eye of a needle than it would be for me to pull the pieces of this puzzle together. Then it struck me. It appears as though his attacks are becoming more personal. I looked to my friend for some evidence I was on the right track and was rewarded with a look of his extreme excitement. I continued. The first few victims were bitten on their legs and feet, attacked at night while they were sleeping in an alley or side street, where there were few, if any, potential witnesses to the crimes. The wounds were tentative and superficial, perhaps opportunistic practice runs. The next few victims were also bitten on the legs, but instead of being in some remote section of town, they were attacked at the edges of the market square during the twilight hours, with numerous witnesses present. Since most of the victims and many of the witnesses were street vendors and merchants, they were less of a retaliatory threat because they would have been burdened with their trays and carts filled with trade goods. But the challenge was still increased because the stakes were higher. More witnesses might mean easier identification and or easier capture by onlookers at the time of the attack. The more recent attacks are different than the others, however. I paused a moment to collect my thoughts. How were they different? I discovered making the intuitive leap from hard evidence to reasoned conclusions was more difficult than I had anticipated. It was a skill, up to now, I had taken for granted in my friend. Now that I found myself required to make deductions based on singular pieces of evidence, I was amazed to find myself at a loss for words. It felt impossible to express verbally what I perceived intuitively. Sir Happy was in perfect form, as though anticipating the very problem I was struggling with. He said, "It is a bit harder than it looks, Mommy. Believe me when I say I understand the difficulty. The ability to express what I see sometimes is more of a challenge than discerning the clues themselves." "I could not have said it better myself, dear friend," I replied. "Try this then, Mommy," Sir Happy said. "Step away from the narrative and tell me what you see. Don't interpret, just express in words the things that jump out at you. What is different with them cases?" Happy's patience was the very thing I needed, and taking a bit of his advice, I began to focus on the details rather than the conclusions. The bites are higher up on the body. They are more focused on the torso, arms, and face. Inflicting maximum damage seems more of the focus than just the initial bite and run of the previous attacks. It took more time with these victims. Also, look at the time of day for the last 7 victims. They occurred in broad daylight, as though the assailant was unconcerned with getting caught. The one little girl, who almost lost her leg, was literally ripped from her father's arms. It was a brazen attack and appears to be completely focused on the girl. Why would the creature not attack the father? It is as though the girl was the intended victim before the first bite was made. I would say, just based on the photos, mind you, were it not for the girl's father beating the animal off of her, she might have been killed. Cold shivers ran through my body at the thought. There's evil in this, Sir Happy, as well as unbridled rage. Please tell me the poor child is all right." Sir Happy again seemed lost in thought for a moment, but he very quickly replied, "Yes, she is recovering nicely at the family's country estate. I dare say, however, she will carry emotional wounds which will take much longer to heal than the ones which ravaged her body." Again, his thoughtful gaze. Considering the gravity of the subject, I did not immediately continue, allowing my friend as much time as he needed to contemplate whatever dark realizations were burgeoning in his mind. After a few minutes, he looked at me and said, "Now, Mommy, do not congratulate yourself yet. There are still a few details you have yet to express. Please continue with your observations." Admittedly, I was growing weary with this intellectual exercise. My physical weakness had apparently placed certain limits on my mental capacity, on my mental acuity. I sighed and tried to continue where I left off, but my momentum was lost to me. "At the moment, I have nothing more," I finally admitted. My friend looked a bit disappointed by what he perceived to be mental complacency. "Come now, Mommy," he began. "Look more closely at the bites. They are not all the same." I looked long and hard at the photos again, just to appease my friend. "By Jove, you are right. Not all of these bites are from the same mouth. 2 or 3 of the attacks occurred on the same day, almost at the same time, but at completely different ends of town. There is no way, even with the fastest carriage, that an individual could race from one location to the other in such a short amount of time. Also, the bite marks are decidedly smaller, which means they came from a creature with a smaller head and jaw. Perhaps there is a copycat biter, or perhaps there is no connection aside from the nature of the wounds." Sir Happy jumped to his feet and exclaimed, "Bravo! You have found the most important clues." As I glanced over the photos spread out in front of us, my heart leaped in my chest. "I do believe there is one more clue left to be found," I exclaimed. This declaration took my friend completely by surprise. I was growing so accustomed to him catching every minute detail. I was completely taken aback by his surprise, almost to the point of losing my line of thought. My friend was eager for me to share whatever point of inspiration he had apparently missed, and began to press me mercilessly to divulge the details. I gave him a devilish grin and said, "Allow me a moment to savor catching the one clue which my dear impeccably observant friend apparently missed." I stretched broadly and looked up at the ceiling, as though I were absorbing the moment with every pore and cell within me. We shall see how monumental your clue is once you have gotten around to sharing it with the rest of us. He winked at me and gave me a warm smile, which told me he was intrigued and not at all sore at my jest. I focused back on the items before us and said, "I was looking at the locations of the various attacks from the very first ones on down to the later occurrences. There is a pattern which might direct us more towards the habits of our assailant." Sir Happy crinkled his brow at me, an expression which was none too flattering for such a noble creature. "I am not following you. Take it point by point, if you please." "Look here," I said, motioning to a map of London that was conveniently at hand. "Excluding the victims whose bites appear unrelated to our investigation, the first few attacks occurred here, very near the edge of the city, where it begins to transform into a more rural environment. The next series of attacks occur in the heart of London, and then appear to move back to the same general rural locale. The final series of attacks have occurred back in the heart of London. The attacks seem to cluster in two areas, one urban and one rural. It appears to me, were we to follow just the movements of the assailant and ignore his crimes for the moment, we would find ourselves following an individual who was perhaps traveling between jobs or between a country home and a city residence. Most families of means, who spend part of the year in the country and part of the year in the city, have servants who travel with them. Perhaps our assailant is somehow associated with a wealthy family. Perhaps one of the servants or relation of one of the staff." I was waiting for my friend to shoot down my musings as utterly preposterous, but instead received a round of accolades. "Well done, Mr. Marmee. You found a very fortuitous clue indeed. I am highly impressed and commend you for your fast wit." He seemed exceedingly proud of my discovery. In my uncertainty, I asked, "You mean it has merit?" I was a little afraid he was jesting with me, wanting me to think I had found something of use when indeed I had not. He clapped me soundly on the back and said, "It has a great deal of merit, and may prove to be more valuable to our investigation than you might think. I'm proud of you, old man. Before long, I shall be looking to you to solve our cases." I gave a hearty laugh at the notion, but quite pleased nonetheless he would say such a thing. "Fear not, Sir Happy," I said cheerfully. "I shall not allow my momentary success to go to my head just yet. The mystery is not solved, and we have a long road ahead of us before it is." With that, we continued discussing the evidence before us.